Hey, it's Greg Brown, the storyteller, poet laureate of aviation. Grab your logbook, because it's time for another flying carpet cockpit adventure. I'm an aviation author, adventure columnist, photographer, and former National Flight Instructor of the Year. The Flying Carpet is a 4-place single-engine light airplane. In it, my wife Jean and I have long traveled the North American continent, searching behind clouds for the real America. Learn more at my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com, where you can also see photos from most episodes. While there, order one of the few remaining autographed copies of my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane, for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. You're probably aware that during the recent longest ever U.S. government shutdown, airline traffic was restricted at 14 major airports around the country. But you may not be aware that those same airports closed entirely to general aviation or GA traffic, meaning non-airline private and business aircraft. That aborted my plan to pick up friends at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. But the experience reminded me of how fortunate we GA pilots are to fly generally open skies. And at the same time, it reminded me of 2 previous occasions when our piloting privileges were limited or taken away. Some pilot listeners will remember the pain following the 9/11 terrorist attacks when all general aviation traffic was grounded. Well, an earlier historical event had a longer-lasting effect on general aviation, impacting, among other flights, my personal first-ever West Coast piloting journey. That's what this episode is about. First, a bit of explanation for you non-pilots. To legally fly in clouds or low visibility, pilots must be under continuous air traffic control, or ATC, guidance on an Instrument Flight Rules, or IFR, flight plan, including instrument approaches to landing under poor weather conditions. So let's talk air traffic control, or ATC, facilities for a moment. Most listeners will be familiar with control towers that manage takeoffs and landings at a given airport. At busier airports, control towers are supplemented by radar approach control facilities that manage aircraft arrivals and departures. In other words, they hand off incoming and outgoing traffic to the next facility. Overlying everything are 22 U.S. Air Route Traffic Control Centers, commonly referred to by pilots as center. And these centers manage traffic in all airspace above and between those other facilities. Now, most instrument flying, and again, instrument flying we're talking about, you can't see out the window, so you're flying by instruments. Most instrument flying is accomplished by filing an IFR flight plan before takeoff. Under normal circumstances, it's also allowable when encountering deteriorating weather and you're flying visually to radio the nearest air traffic control facility, could be tower, approach control, or center, and request what's called a pop-up instrument clearance. And for you pilots, you can learn a little bit more about the limitations of pop-up clearances on Flying Carpet podcast number 8, Painted into a Corner. In any case, that's the background for today's episode. So climb into the Flying Carpet, buckle up your seatbelts, and prepare for takeoff on today's adventure, Lessons and Landmarks. Clear prop.
Mike, I've been calling you for over 2 minutes.
I was climbing with Gene and two other pilot buddies out of Salt Lake City International Airport in a Cessna 210 Centurion. Frantically, I apologized for missing the controller's calls.
"There are mountains out there,"
he chided.
"What if you missed a critical vector or a traffic call?"
He was right, of course, and I was deeply embarrassed. There was little danger as we were in good visual conditions above a cloud deck, but we were flying an instrument flight plan, and missing his calls was inexcusable. Why such a blunder? While another pilot flew, I was monitoring two radio frequencies at once, urgently trying to file an instrument flight plan to address deteriorating weather for our upcoming final flight leg homeward from Southern California to Lafayette, Indiana. Three months earlier, in August 1981, President Reagan had fired some 12,000 air traffic controllers when they walked out on strike. The effects on the general aviation community were devastating as the air traffic control system struggled to recover. With only a few mostly management controllers remaining to rebuild the system, ATC initially focused their services exclusively to airline and military traffic, suspending instrument clearances and radar flight following for all non-emergency private and corporate aircraft. Why did this matter? Because much of the U.S. routinely experiences inclement weather that's not flyable under visual conditions. In fact, instrument flying weather is so common for most of the year that it's rare to complete long flying missions without reverting to instrument flying for part of the trip. Lacking that capability, flyers can be grounded mid-journey for hours or even days. What's more, ATC flight following helps VFR pilots, those flying visually, to stay safe via traffic and weather advisories. To address the post-strike staffing crisis, qualified air traffic controllers were siphoned from management, flight service, the military, and most noticeably to us personal and business flyers, less busy ATC facilities. Control towers closed in many locations, while others drastically reduced operating hours to simply meet airline schedules. This impacted even fair weather cross-country planning, because in those days before automated weather stations, few airports reported weather without an operating control tower. Reduced weather reporting also limited instrument approach availability when IFR clearances gradually became available. The initial staffing shortage primarily affected air route traffic control centers and major airport TRACON approach control facilities. Again, for you non-pilots, TRACON is basically a much bigger approach control covering many airports, such as in the New York area. To bypass center ATC facilities, General Aviation pilots learned they could sometimes file instruments outside center airspace using a previously little-known mechanism called tower en route. As the name suggests, this meant navigating via handoffs between adjacent control tower and approach control airspace and staying out of center airspace, staying below it or going around it. Providing the tower and approach control airspace connected throughout and you timed your flight while all relevant facilities were open, an often circuitous route would get you to some destinations. But any gaps between local ATC airspace facilities meant you could not go on instruments. Outside populated areas featuring adjacent ATC facilities, this was of course impossible. Avoiding weather was also a concern, particularly regarding icing and thunderstorms, since limited routes and low flight altitudes were often necessary to avoid center airspace. As this hodgepodge system became formalized over time, the FAA closed terminal airspace gaps where feasible and raised approach control ceilings. Then they published tower and route listings to enable and expedite more traffic. Next, as ATC staffing gradually improved, the FAA began offering very limited GA instrument flight reservations. 2 hourly general aviation slots reservable 24 hours in advance. Pop-up instrument flight clearances were prohibited following the strike, so you needed to file instruments ahead of time for every flight leg to accommodate any possible foul weather. Planning IFR trips meant calling flight service precisely 24 hours in advance of your takeoff time with fingers crossed. Vagaries, such as changing weather and altered schedules, were sources of constant stress. Still, by 3 months after the strike, these developments created enough relative air traffic control normalcy to attempt my first ever West Coast journey. My buddy Al and I, then Purdue faculty members, had professional presentations to make in Los Angeles. I'd never flown to the West Coast before, and piloting ourselves there seemed worth the adventure. My wife Jean was excited to join us, as was fellow flying club member Jerry. Together we planned a dream trip across the country. Launching from our then home in Lafayette, Indiana, we refueled at Hutchinson, Kansas, and just beyond the front range of the Rocky Mountains savored our first night in Old Santa Fe. It felt truly magical transporting from Midwestern flatlands and culture to the historic Spanish and Native American-inflected high mountain community in the space of a single day. Mercifully, the ATC reservation system further eased on that first day of our trip, with shortened lead times required for filing IFR and more hourly slots. Although a godsend, that now meant reserving instrument departure times precisely 4 hours before every flight leg. A 4 a.m. phone call was required to reserve an 8 a.m. takeoff reservation. But with the notable exception of the scenic and normally dry desert Southwest, I dared not abandon the security of instrument flight plans on such a long and tightly scheduled trip. With pop-up instrument clearances prohibited except for emergencies, only pre-filed instrument flight plans could accommodate unexpected foul weather. And indeed, we'd log over 4 hours in the clouds over this journey. That led to some acrimony on our trip, as some of my companions understandably wanted to fly VFR for better sightseeing, where we could direct our own course and altitude rather than be routed at higher altitudes under IFR constraints. Anyway, Day 2 led us westward from Santa Fe to thread Monument Valley's mystical Crimson Buttes, then via the Colorado River over surreal gold and cobalt Lake Powell and Marble Canyon. We landed to refuel at Grand Canyon Airport. This was long before the Grand Canyon Special Flight Rules area, so after takeoff, we dipped below the canyon rim and traced the Colorado River through its stunning mile-deep gorge, emerging over Lake Mead near Las Vegas. From there, we traversed the stark Mojave Desert southwestward, then California's coastal range, and maintaining altitude over the Los Angeles Basin to conserve gliding range, we steered westward out over the blue Pacific. Our destination for that night was gem-like Santa Catalina Island, 22 miles off the Southern California coast. How we learned of this place I don't remember, but there was an airport there, and given my ongoing fascination with landing on islands, it seemed a worthy destination. But if steering out to sea was thought-provoking for us landlocked Midwesterners, discovering Catalina's airport in the sky, perched among many peaks at 1,600 feet near the pinnacle of the island, was a shocker. Another surprise was receiving landing instructions from airport staff on Unicom frequency rather than an official control tower. "Watch out for that mountain," shouted my co-pilot as we found ourselves diving directly toward a small peak on base leg to runway 4. I turned final a bit high and touched down a little fast. 3,000 feet should be plenty of runway for a Cessna 210, but it looked far shorter than that. Catalina Airport regulars know that the runway slopes downhill on runway 4, and a mid-runway crest gives the illusion that the strip ends far sooner than it really does. But I'd consulted no regulars, and the result was hair-raising. I slammed on the brakes when seemingly approaching the 1,600-foot drop-off at runway's end. What a relief it was to find more pavement beyond the crest, only to discover that from there it slopes even steeper downhill. I remember checking our tires for bald spots after landing, and later learned at the airport office that 2 aircraft had recently run off the end of the runway, one yet to be removed. Over years flying the East and Midwest, I'd become accustomed to evaluating airports based mostly on the airport chart. If the runway was long enough and not dangerously obstructed, it was safe to land there. But our Catalina experience taught me the hard way to always thoroughly research new-to-me mountain airports before landing there. Now I phone ahead to learn of any special landing or takeoff considerations, and for particularly challenging airports, I seek out local pilots for guidance. After sightseeing the island's town of Avalon the next morning, we hopped 48 miles to Burbank for our meeting, and 4 days later flew the rugged coastline to San Jose to visit friends. That included my first IFR experience flying Southern California's Marine Layer. Departing San Jose, we made a fuel and casino stop at Reno, Nevada, before overnighting at Salt Lake City. That's where I got bawled out on departure for missing the radio call. But we proceeded safely to Grand Island, Nebraska to refuel, and from there flew my zealously filed instrument flight plan home to Lafayette. ATC's post-strike flight restrictions faded over the following 2 years. Yet they figure prominently in the lessons and landmarks of that long-ago cross-country Odyssey through the Grand Canyon to Catalina's airport in the sky. A postscript to this story. For quite a while after visiting Catalina Island, I figured that my mountain flying newbie status back then made our landing experience more of a personal unfamiliarity thing than reflecting larger challenges associated with the airport. But over time, I've learned that Catalina Island is widely regarded as one of the more challenging airports around. In fact, many LA and San Diego flight schools do booming businesses checking out pilots to land there. What's more, I learned that whenever possible, local pilots land on runway 22, which of course slopes uphill. Runway 4, on which we landed downhill in the story, is considered so challenging that one local flight instructor estimates 50 to 75% of pilots attempting to land on it go around the first time. And several pilots who fly there frequently noted seeing airplanes off the end. There are several reasons for this, in addition to runway slope. Easterly Santa Ana winds favoring runway 4 flow from over the nearby California coastal range, generating turbulence and sometimes mountain wave. Also, there's the optical illusion of being too low when approaching a downsloping runway, which causes pilots to actually adjust to the point of being too high on final, which is exactly what happened to me when I landed there. So I went from thinking, I hope I'm not scaring pilots away from this cool airport with my story, to, let's hope after hearing this story, pilots will feel the need for a proper checkout before landing there themselves. Thanks for riding along on today's Flying Carpet adventure. Find photos from most episodes at gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. Learn more at my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com, where you can also see photos from most episodes. While there, order one of the few remaining autographed copies of my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane. for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. You'll also find my other aviation books there and my Views from the Flying Carpet aerial photography available in fine art metal prints. Please support this podcast by sharing your favorite episodes on social media, posting reviews on your favorite podcast directories, and donating via gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. I welcome your feedback via my website, via my Flying Carpet Podcast Facebook group. Finally, follow my social media sites by searching Greg Brown Flying Carpet, and consider joining my Student Pilot Pep Talk Facebook group. Thanks, Carter Olson, for the tagline. Music by Hannes Brown. See you next time.